Sechas Nazir Daf Nun Beis begins with a sugya about what happens if you have a barrier, you have a living creature that is missing one of its organs or more. Does that have the halacha of barrier, which we will see what it is, and we'll have a question, and Mar will attempt to bring a proof and reject it. Then we'll get to the sugya of a shidra and a gulgolis, which is a skull and spine, and we'll see if they count separately or if they only count together to create tumas ohel and bimatami a nazir. And the Gemara will bring several proofs on that topic. So let's begin. The Gemara, the bottom of Daf Nun Aleph, introduces a question that was asked by Rava. We know there's a concept in halacha called a biria or a beria, which is an animal that is in its life form, where it's not bottle, and when it gets malchus for eating it. So Rava's question was, is that because of its shape, because of the size of the body, that it has all parts on it, so if it's missing something, it doesn't have that halacha? Or is it because it has life in it? So if you have a living ant that's missing a couple of legs, does that have the din of a beria because it's living? Or does that have the din of not a beria, but just a piece of iser, which becomes bottle very easily because it is missing legs and it's not all there? So the Gemara says Rav Yehuda of Diskarta brought a proof from a lima that the Gemara has. If a brisa learns out the halacha of the minimum size of tumas shratzim. The minimum size for tumas shratzim is a kadasha, the size of a lentil, and the way you get that is from a contradiction of psukim. The pasuk says about them, first it says bahem, which implies you have to touch the entire sheretz in order to be matame, and then it says mayhem, which implies even if you only touch part of the sheretz, you are matame. So the Gemara says the contradiction between the two is that has to be bahem, which is similar to mayhem, and that means that it is the minimum size. You don't have to have the entire sheretz, but you do have to have the minimum size, which is equal to the smallest possible complete sheretz, which is a mole at the time that it's born, which is the size of an adasha, the size of a lentil, and that's why the size is like the size of an adasha. So the Gemara says, if you don't need legs, you could be missing legs and still be a beria, so then the mole, even without its legs, could still be considered to be a sheretz. And therefore, why do we say that the minimum size is the size of an adasha, which is a full mole at the time it's born? Go even smaller and go with the mole when it's missing its legs. So the Gemara answers no, because there, at the time that it gets life, it has its legs. We're talking about the minimum, the smallest possible size of the creation of life, and the status of beria begins, and that's a mole when it's born, and it'll have all its legs. If you have legs removed later, that is not going to define what the concept of a beria is, and therefore the minimum size of an existing beria at the time when it begins is an adasha, and not less than that. However, it is possible that even if something gets smaller than that, or something loses part of its legs, that it would still get the status of a beria, so we don't have a complete, conclusive proof about that. The Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah and begins this next sugya. The Mishnah had listed amongst the things that are matami and nazir and cause him to lose his nazirus and have to start over again and have to do the entire procedure is the shidra and the gulgolis. That's the skull and the spine. So the Gemara says, do we mean each one of those individually, a skull or a spine? Or did we mean the two of them together, but each one separately does not? Now, this is a question in Hilchas Ohel, because these things are matame ba'ol. It's matame nazir when he enters an Ohel. If he touches them or carries them, it's matame him anyway, in a much smaller amount. We should discuss if the same question applies to stam tumas ohel, or are we only talking about a nazir as far as tumas ohel? But that is the Gemara's question. What did the Mishnah mean when it said spine and skull? Did it mean both together or even each one separately? So the Gemara tries to bring a large number of rayas here. So the Gemara's first proof is brought by Rava. Rava brings a brisa that lists amongst things that are tahar, a spine with the ribs attached. That's the ribs are considered to be the spine, but the ribs are broken or cut. And it says that if the ribs are broken or cut, it's tahar. Says the Gemara. So that implies that if the ribs would be whole, it would be okay. But it doesn't say anything about having a skull there. So you see that the spine with the ribs is mitame, even without the skull, is a clear proof that we meant each one separately. So the Gemara says no. It didn't say anything about the skull. It could be that there is a skull. It could be that there isn't a skull. We haven't a proof either way. We're just talking about whether the spine counts as a spine with its ribs or without its ribs. And we're saying the spine without, where the ribs are cut or broken, doesn't count as a spine. But it could be that we're talking about where the skull is there all along. Okay. The Gemara's next proof is from a brisa discussing 6 arguments that Rabbi Yehuda had with the Chachamim, where Rabbi Akiva was Matam and the Chachamim were Matar. We're going to get into them in our third proof, but for now, we're just going to go to the end of the brisa, where the brisa brings a story. It says there was an incident that happened where they brought a box of bones to the base medrash of Tarsim, the Tarsi base medrash, or the Tunisian, and they didn't want to be matame anybody, so they put it in a place that had no roof. And at Todos, the doctor, and all the other doctors came in to examine it to see if it was tamei or not. The sugya they were referring to was if you have a mace, if you have the minimum size that comes from 2 different maces, if that's an issue or not. We'll get into that in the next proof. But what it says there is that they examined it and they said that there is no spine from one mace there. So the implication is that had there been a spine from one mace, it would have been tamei. They were retired because there was no spine from one mace. But you see, they didn't require a skull. And if there would have been a spine from one mace, it would have been enough. So you see, when it says skull and spine, it means skull or spine. So the Gemara says this is again not a proof. It could have been just saying you need to have the skull and the spine, but there isn't even a spine. So therefore, it's irrelevant if there's a skull or not. Even the spine is not there, and that resolves the issue. But in Hanami, you do require the skull as well. We now get to the Gemara's next proof, which comes from the Brisa that actually lists the 6 things that Rabbi Akiva was matame and the Chachamim were matayr. Now here we're referring to a Nazir specifically, that Rabbi Akiva was matame them, and the Nazir was matayr. And Rabbi Akiva actually backtracked; he was chayzer on these things. So the Gemara quotes the Brisa. The Brisa says that the 6 things, and it uses the number 6, are as follows. Number 1 is an aver min hames, that comes from 2 different mesim. That is one aver, which is matamei tumas oh, because it's a complete aver. But if it's made of 2 different avarim from 2 different corpses, there Rabbi Akiva is matame and the Chachamim matahir. Aver min achai, which is also matame and an oel. And again, if it comes from 2 different people, Rabbi Akiva is matame and the Chachamim are matahir. A half a kav of the bones of a mace. Here we know we're talking about Nazir because Nazir becomes tamei in a half a kav, while Tumas Oel is only in a quarter kav. And again, this half kav is made up of 2 mesim. Rabbi Akiva is matame and Chachamim are matahir. A revius of blood. That's also the same thing from 2 different mesim. Rabbi Akiva is matame and Chachamim are matahir. A bone which is the size of a barley grain that is split into 2. It's 2 different sources for the barley grain, and there again, and then those are 5 so far. And the last on the list is the shidra and the golgolas, the spine and the skull, which come from 2 different mesim. Now the Gemara says if shidra and golgolas, of spine and skull, are meant to be interpreted separately as 2 different things, then you have 7 things on the list, not 6. So obviously they're meant to be interpreted as 1. So Mary gives 4 answers to this. The statement for that is Yachad Shehu Gilach Ve'echad. 4 different ways that you can arrive at the number 6 with having the spine and the skull be counted separately. So the first way is that you take out of this the bone which is the size of a barley, because that is only Rabbi Akiva against 1 person, not Rabbi Akiva against the Chachamim, and therefore wasn't included in the list. The list was only 6 things, which is the majority of Chachamim against Rabbi Akiva. We already see that it was only 1 against him, so the Gemara quotes at Brisa. It says in Rabbi Akiva's matame and on Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's matayr, so it's only 1 person that's matayr. Our second answer is you take aver min hames. You take aver min achai out of the list because the 6 was only 6 things that are all from the dead, not aver min achai, which is from a living person. Our third answer is you take the etzem kasair, you take the bone the size of the barley off the list because that is not matame and nazir in the ohel. We only listed things that are matame in the ohel. And the Gemara's fourth answer is that you only listed the things that Rabbi Akiva was chayzer, that he backtracked on, and therefore you take a revius of blood that comes from 2 different corpses off the list because there Rabbi Akiva was not chayzer, as Rebbe said to Bar Kapara, don't have revius of blood on the list of things that Rabbi Akiva was chayzer on, because he was not. He had good sources for it, and also there's a pasuk that explicitly supports it, like it says, I'll call nafshos meis lo yavo, that you should not come to 2 souls. Souls generally refers to blood, and it says nafshos plural, to show that blood coming from 2 different sources can combine to the shiur of tumah. Now the Gemara quotes parenthetically Rabbi Shimon, who was Rabbi Akiva's Talmud, said that all his days Rabbi Akiva was metame, blood that comes from two corpses. Whether he changed, and he wasn't chayzer. If he was chayzer after he died, says Rabbi Shimon, I don't know. Now that was considered to be a chutzpah. Was speaking disrespectfully toward his Rebbe, and Rabbi Shimon, as part of doing tshuva for that, fasted a lot, and his teeth blackened from all the fasting that he did for that slip of the tongue. The Gemara now moves on to its next proof. This is from a brisa which brings three opinions about the rova hakav, quarter of a kav of bones that is metame in an ohel. The three opinions are Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and Shammai. And there's Rabbi Shua who wants to put Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai together. So the question is, how many different bones can this rova hakav be derived from? So Beis Shammai says it can be from two or three. It can't be from only one. It doesn't have to be from more than two or three. Beis Hillel says it has to be from a whole bunch, either the majority of the height of the corpse, of the skeleton, or the majority of the number of bones in the body. Now, Rabbi Shua says I could put Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai together as one opinion, because it's possible to have Beis Hillel's opinion in two or three. You could have the majority of the height in just three bones, if you have leg and larger bones, so you could have just three being the majority of the height. You could also have the majority of the number of bones being in just two or three avarim, two or three limbs, because if you have a hand or a foot, there's a vast number of tiny bones there, and therefore you can end up with a lot of the bones. Anyway, that's Beis Hillel Beis Shammai's opinion. We're going to focus on Shammai, who disagrees with Beis Shammai. Shammai says it could even be one bone from the skull or from the spine. So you see clearly that Beis Shammai holds you only need one bone, and the skull and the spine are matame separately, because he says one bone. He says a bone from the skull or from the spine. Only one of those is enough. So the Gemara says, okay, you've proven that Beis Shammai does hold that you don't need the skull and the spine together. However, that's only Beis Shammai who's very much machmir on this and says it's matame even for just one bone. It doesn't prove anything about the chachamim, and those are the ones that we really want to know. So the Gemara says no, it does prove about the chachamim, because the only difference between Shammai and the chachamim is if you have to have one bone or more bones. But the chachamim aren't saying you have to have the skull and the spine together. If you have two bones from either the skull or two bones from the spine, they would be okay with that. They just need two bones. They don't need to have one from the skull and one from the spine. You don't see that here. So the Gemara says, no, you can't prove that from here either. The Gemara says, no, Beis Hillel, Shammai is very much machmir, and that's why Shammai says it's off if it's even from one. But the Rabbanan who are makon, going leniently, would say possibly you need to have from both of them. So the Gemara says, so then let's prove the other way. Let's prove that it's only because Shammai is machmir that he says it's enough to have just one. But the Rabbanan who want to be lenient would say that you even have to have from both of them. They say you have to have two. If you have to have twos in this thing, you have to have from both the skull and from the spine. The Gemara says, no, can't prove that either, because it could just be that the Rabbanan are saying you have to have multiple bones, and that's the leniency that they have. But if you had a complete skull, or if you had a complete spine, they would be okay with that because of the completeness of it. You don't have to have a multiplicity in that situation.